You know that feeling, right? That little voice inside. Sometimes it's just a nudge. Sometimes it feels more like a judge telling you how things should
Oh,
be.
ooh, absolutely.
Like I should be getting more done, or maybe my house should look perfect, or even looking at someone else thinking they really shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, it's like we carry around this invisible rule book.
Exactly. Judging ourselves, judging the world around us.
It's such a common experience, that pressure, or that disappointment when things just don't line up with some standard we hold, often without even realizing it.
Right.
And these should thoughts, they're woven into our everyday thinking. But when they get really rigid or absolute or just happen all the time, they can be more than just, passing thoughts. They might actually signal a specific pattern in how we think, something called a cognitive distortion.
Cognitive distortion. Okay, that sounds a bit technical,
Hmm.
maybe intense. Let's
Y-
unpack that. For someone hearing this term for the first time, what is a cognitive distortion really?
Yeah, it can sound a bit clinical, but think of them simply as like habitual ways of looking at reality that aren't entirely accurate. They're kind of irrational thought patterns.
Like mental filters.
Exactly, like filters or lenses that get smudged or warped. They twist how we interpret things, events, ourselves, other people, and that distorted view, it directly shapes how we feel and then, how we act.
So our view gets skewed, and that affects our emotions and behavior.
Precisely. And look, we all do this sometimes, maybe when we're stressed out or tired or just reacting quickly without thinking. It's normal in small doses.
Okay.
But they become a real problem, potentially harmful even, when they're persistent or really extreme or super rigid. Psychologically, they matter because they often reinforce negative beliefs about ourselves or the world.
Hmm.
And they're strongly linked to conditions like anxiety and depression. They can keep you feeling stuck in these unhelpful cycles of thinking and feeling.
And this isn't a new idea, is it? Trying to understand these faulty thinking patterns.
Oh, not at all. It's got a solid history in psychology, rooted in some really foundational therapies. You have thinkers like Albert Ellis, who developed rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT, and Aaron Beck, who's often called the father of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. They were pioneers in identifying these patterns.
What do they notice?
Well, Beck, for instance, he observed these automatic distorted thought processes, as he called them, often biased negatively, especially against oneself. Ellis, on the other hand, really honed in on the demanding, absolute nature of certain irrational beliefs,
Demanding. How so?
particularly beliefs involving words like must and should, which, brings us right to our focus for this deep dive.
Right. So out of all these different cognitive distortions, today we're really zeroing in on one that just feels so common, should statements.
Exactly. And to really get into it, we've pulled together a whole range of sources. We've got some academic stuff giving us the definitions and background. We have therapeutic guides that talk about the impact and, importantly, strategies for change. There are even some personal reflections, which really bring the experience to life.
Mhm.
And interestingly, we even looked into a bit of a linguistic debate about the word should itself. Adds a whole other layer.
That sounds like a really comprehensive mix. So our mission today, using all this material, is essentially to cut through the jargon and give you, listening, a really clear, thorough understanding of should statements.
Yeah.
We want to explore what they actually are, how they mess with our inner world and our actions, and crucially, share some practical insights from these sources on how you can start to spot them and maybe challenge them.
It's about gaining that knowledge quickly and thoroughly about a mental pattern that might be having a bigger effect on your life than you realize.
Helping you see these thoughts for what they are,
Mm-hmm.
maybe think a bit more flexibly, be a bit kinder to yourself,
Yeah.
all based on what these sources tell us.
Exactly. Offering pathways to maybe shift that thinking.
Perfect. Okay, let's dive right in, the core of it. When we talk about should statements as this cognitive distortion, how are they actually defined in our sources? What are we really dealing with here?
Well, at the most basic level, the sources describe them as these beliefs about how things absolutely must or ought to be.
Okay, must or ought.
Yeah. Therapist Aid puts it pretty simply. The belief that things should be a certain way. Oak Health expands on that a little, calling it telling yourself that things should be the way you hoped or expected to be.
So it's not just noticing how things are, it's having this fixed picture of how they have to be, like a non-negotiable standard.
Precisely. And the critical thing isn't just the word should, it's the psychology behind it. Oak Health really highlights this. In the context of the distortion, these should statements act as absolutes.
Absolutely.
They function as rules we must follow sometimes at any cost. That's the key bit. They're not just preferences like, I'd like it if. They become these rigid, often unspoken demands we put on ourselves or on other people or even on the world itself.
Rigid demands. Yeah, you can immediately see how that could cause problems. Doesn't leave much room for, well, reality.
It really doesn't. And this idea of rigid demands, it takes us straight back to Albert Ellis and his work with REBT. He actually had a pretty memorable, if slightly jarring, term for this tendency.
Ah, right. I think I know the one you mean. Masturbation.
That's the one. Ellis used that term deliberately provocative, to really highlight this human tendency to turn perfectly reasonable preferences into absolute inflexible demands, to rely on these rigid musts, shoulds, and oughts.
Provocative, but it makes the point.
It does. And in the source material, like the interview describing his work, Ellis makes this sharp contrast between what he called rational beliefs and irrational beliefs.
Okay, rational versus irrational. What's the difference, according to Ellis?
So rational beliefs, in his view, are flexible. They're preferences. They sound more like, I really don't like this situation, or I wish things were different, or how annoying.
Okay, so acknowledging displeasure or desire, but accepting reality.
Exactly. There's a recognition of what is, even if you don't like it. Irrational beliefs, on the other hand, are those rigid demands. They come from that thought process of, because I don't like this, it absolutely should not exist. It must not be this way. I can't stand it.
Ah, okay, so the key difference is moving from I want this to I demand this, and I can't tolerate it if it's not this way.
Precisely. It's the gap between having a strong preference and feeling like it's an absolute necessity. And Ellis believed that a lot of our emotional distress actually comes from just a few core irrational demands. He identified 3 basic musts that he saw as underpinning a lot of what he called, neurotic behavior.
Okay, I'm curious, what are these 3 core demands?
All right, the first one is directed at the self. I must do well and be loved by people, or I am no good.
Oof, that's heavy. Performance and approval equals worth.
Yeah, it's that intense internal pressure. Your value is totally conditional on hitting targets or being liked. A lot of people feel that, I think.
Definitely. Okay, what's the second one?
The second demand is aimed at other people. You people absolutely must treat me kindly, nobly, and considerately, or you are worthless, you are no good.
Wow. So expecting everyone else to live up to your standards of behavior and judging them harshly if they don't.
Exactly. The rigid expectation that they have to act a certain way. And of course, they often don't, right? People have their own stuff going on.
Which leads to frustration, I imagine.
Huge frustration and anger. Okay. And the third demand is about the world or life conditions. Conditions under which I live must absolutely be better than they are. They must give me exactly what I want and never really deprive me.
So demanding that life itself be easy, fair, and always deliver what you want. A refusal to accept hardship or disappointment.
Pretty much. It's rejecting reality when it's difficult or doesn't match your desires, demanding that life must conform to your wishes.
Okay, putting those 3 together demands on self, others, and the world. It really does feel like a setup for constant disappointment and frustration.
Ellis definitely saw it that way. And the whole point of REDT, he explained, is to help people first identify these irrational demands, then see how they're causing the distress, and then actively challenge them, dispute them, give them up.
So replace the demands.
Replace the rigid musts and shoulds with more flexible, rational preferences. He'd reframe it, like moving from I must do well to something like I'd really like to do well, but I don't have to.
Okay.
Or from you must treat me kindly to it would be great if you treat me kindly, but, well, you obviously don't have to.
Just hearing that shift in language,
Yeah.
it feels lighter, doesn't it? Less
Yeah.
pressure.
It really does. It acknowledges the desire, but removes that crushing weight of necessity. It allows for imperfection, for the unpredictable nature of life and other people.
Right.
Now, having said all that, it's important to acknowledge, as you hinted at earlier, that the word should isn't always used in this really rigid, demanding, psychologically problematic way.
Yeah, like my apple example. Take 2 apples, there should be 10 left. That's just logic, not a demand causing distress.
Exactly. And this nuance actually came up in one of the sources, a Reddit thread, where people were discussing how we use the word should.
Oh, interesting. What did they say?
Well, they highlighted that difference. There's the should of assumed expectation based on logic, probability, common sense, like the train should be here soon or water should boil at 100 degrees
That's
Celsius,
like factual expectations.
versus the should that expresses a moral obligation or how things ought to be in a prescriptive sense, like I should call my parents more often or people should be more honest.
And it's that second one, the ought-to-be version, that overlaps with the cognitive distortion we're talking about.
Correct. Though the Reddit discussion even got into whether that kind of ought always implies a preference.
How so?
Well, one perspective was that it's just stating a rule or obligation you should pay your taxes is a rule, whether you like it or not. The other side argued that underlying any statement about how things ought to be, there's still an implicit preference that they actually be that way.
Okay, that's a fascinating linguistic detour. But for our purposes here, understanding the cognitive distortion, it's really the psychological impact that matters most, isn't it? Regardless of the pure linguistics.
Absolutely. The distortion isn't about winning a debate on grammar or philosophy. It's about the psychological weight the word carries when it creates those inflexible internal rules that lead to negative feelings, guilt, anger, anxiety, disappointment.
Right.
So if thinking I should always be strong makes you hide your feelings and feel ashamed when you inevitably feel vulnerable, that's the distortion in action. It doesn't really matter if you could argue about whether should implies preference or obligation in that sentence. The impact is the key.
It's the rigidity, the demand, and the negative emotional fallout.
Got it. That distinction is really helpful. Okay, so we understand what they are now, these rigid demands about how we, others, or the world must operate. Let's really dig into the impact. What do these shoulds actually do to us? Oh, the impact is pretty far-reaching. It touches almost every part of our inner and outer lives. One of the most immediate effects is that they create these really unrealistic expectations. And they foster rigidity in our thinking.
Rigidity.
Oak Health puts it clearly. Should statements establish a rigid criteria for yourself and others.
Rigid criteria. Sounds tiring just thinking about it.
It absolutely is. And because life is messy, it's unpredictable, it's fundamentally imperfect, so these rigid criteria, they almost inevitably set one up for failure, as Oak Health says.
Because the bar is set impossibly high.
Often, yeah.
Yeah.
The standards are frequently unreasonable or just plain impossible to meet perfectly all the time. German source talks about this too, linking shoulds to rule-bound thinking and cognitive rigidity. It emphasizes that these standards might be challenging or impossible to attain.
I mean, who can be perfect all the time?
Yeah.
Or expect everyone else to be? It's just not realistic.
Exactly. And then when we inevitably fall short of these impossible shoulds, or when other people or the world don't play by our rigid rules, well, that's when the negative emotions really kick in.
Okay, let's talk about those feelings. What kind of emotions do shoulds typically stir up?
The sources are quite specific here. Oak Health breaks it down nicely. When the should statements are aimed inward at yourself, they commonly lead to feelings of guilt and frustration.
Guilt and frustration.
Yeah, you think, I should have done that thing, and if you didn't, boom, guilt. Or you think, I should be able to handle this easily, and if you struggle, you feel frustrated with yourself.
Yeah, that internal critic just hammering away with shoulds.
Totally. And then when the shoulds are aimed outwards at other people, they typically trigger anger and frustration, often mixed with disappointment.
Like they should have known better.
Exactly. That leads straight to anger. Or this situation should have gone differently, leading to frustration or disappointment. German also connects shoulds, especially within perfectionism, very strongly to anxiety.
Anxiety. How
Yeah.
so?
Well, that fear of not doing things the right way according to the should, or the feeling of being out of control because things aren't matching the should standard, it's all tied together. The rigid rule itself creates fear about breaking the rule.
Ah, okay. So the demand creates the anxiety about failing to meet the demand.
Absolutely. That feeling of being wrong because you didn't measure up to some rigid should standard, that directly fuels anxiety, guilt, shame, frustration. It's a nasty cocktail.
It sounds like a downward spiral.
It can be. Like, I should be happy right now, but maybe you feel sad. So now on top of feeling sad, you feel guilty or wrong for feeling sad, which just layers on more anxiety.
So you end up judging your own natural emotional experience,
Mhm.
adding a should on top of the feeling itself.
You got it. And that brings up another really important point from German. We don't just apply shoulds to our actions or external situations. We apply them to our emotions, too.
Like telling yourself how you should feel.
Exactly. Perfectionists, German notes, often do this, thinking things like, I shouldn't feel anxious, or I shouldn't be angry about this, or I shouldn't feel sad for so long.
Trying to enforce rules on feelings? That sounds like fighting yourself.
It really is. And trying to control or deny those uncomfortable emotions, it creates huge problems with actually regulating them. German points out it leads to a fear of uncomfortable emotions.
I fear of feeling bad.
Yeah, because if you believe you shouldn't feel something, what do? You try to push it down, suppress it, hold it in really tightly. Drummond uses this great metaphor, the soda bottle.
Oh, okay, tell me about the soda bottle.
So imagine your emotions are like the fizz in a soda bottle.
True.
If you shake that bottle up really hard, maybe something stressful happens, and then you try to clamp the lid on tight, refusing to let anything out because you shouldn't feel it.
The pressure builds up inside.
Exactly. The emotion doesn't just vanish. It gets more intense, more volatile under pressure. And when that cap eventually blows off, or you finally let yourself feel it after holding it in for so long, the eruption is way bigger and messier than if you just, acknowledged the feeling gently in the first place.
Wow.
Trying to force an emotion away with like, I shouldn't feel this, actually signals to your brain that the emotion is dangerous or unacceptable, which ironically makes it feel more intense and harder to manage. Allowing yourself to feel it without judgment is often much more effective.
That's a powerful image. Trying to suppress it just makes it stronger. So the rigid thinking leads to rigid emotional control attempts, which just backfires.
Oh.
Okay, what about behavior? How do these thoughts and feelings actually translate into what we do or don't do?
Oh, they definitely drive behavior. Oak Health mentions that should statements can lead directly to avoidance behaviors.
Avoidance, how does that work?
Well, think about it. If you have a should statement, creating an impossibly high standard like, I should write the most amazing, perfect, groundbreaking report ever, the sheer pressure of that can be completely paralyzed.
You feel overwhelmed before you even start.
Exactly. You feel intimidated, maybe inadequate, and so you put off starting the task. You avoid it.
So the quest for the perfect should outcome actually leads to achieving nothing at all, the opposite of what you intend.
Precisely. German connects this directly. Perfectionism, which is fueled by shoulds, defining what's acceptable, is very often linked with procrastination. The intense pressure to meet that unrealistic should, especially if you're already feeling stressed or burnt out, makes just starting feel impossible.
It triggers that all or nothing thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
That if I can't do it perfectly, meet the 100% should, then there's no point in doing it at all, which of course often translates to doing 0% instead of maybe doing it to 80% and just getting it done.
Yeah, that cycle German talks about feeling stuck and paralyzed by the weight of the should.
Right. And German also discusses how these shoulds are often tangled up with a deeper need for control. This drive for things to be the right way, the way they should be according to your internal rules, can apply to all sorts of things.
Like what?
Control over your thoughts, your emotions, external stuff like eating habits, exercise routines, how clean your house is, the exact trajectory your career should follow.
Okay.
But here's the paradox. Sometimes, as we just discussed with avoidance, when that need for perfection dictated by the shoulds becomes too overwhelming, it can actually lead to giving up control altogether or just avoiding the situation entirely. The pressure becomes too much.
Wow. It sounds like these shoulds aren't just surface thoughts then. They seem connected to really fundamental beliefs about ourselves and our place in the world.
They absolutely are. German makes a really powerful connection here. Often, shoulds are tied to a deep-rooted belief of not being enough.
Not being enough.
Yeah. Those rigid standards we set with our shoulds, they become a way we try to prove our worthiness, we chase achievements, we stick to these internal rules because we fundamentally believe that if we can just be perfect or successful or always do the right thing, then maybe, finally, we'll meet that internal should of being acceptable, valuable, enough.
So perfectionism, driven by shoulds, can be like a shield, trying to hide flaws.
Exactly. It can be like a shield, a desperate attempt to manage how others see us, to hide what we perceive as our flaws, to finally earn acceptance from ourselves, maybe, and definitely from others.
If I just meet all these shoulds, then I'll be worthy, then I'll be okay.
That's the underlying thought for many people, and this has huge implications for our relationships, for our need for connection. German talks about how these shoulds heavily influence impression management.
Impression management, like trying to control how people see you.
Yeah, that pressure to constantly say the right things or do the right things so that people will like you, accept you, approve of you.
Performing almost.
It can feel like that. And it often manifests as people-pleasing, driven by a should like, I should always put others first, or I should give and give so they won't leave me.
Believing your value comes from meeting others' needs.
Exactly. Believing your worth in a relationship depends entirely on constantly fulfilling others' expectations, real or imagined, which are dictated by your own internal shoulds about what a good friend or partner or daughter or employee must do.
Which I imagine makes it incredibly hard to set healthy boundaries.
Extremely hard. German points this out directly. This pattern people-pleasing, operating from these shoulds about how you must behave, makes saying no or setting limits feel almost impossible or incredibly guilt-inducing.
And the consequences.
Well, it can lead straight into unhealthy relationship dynamics, codependence even. Emotional burnout is huge. You're constantly giving, pouring from an empty cup, and resentment builds up because your own needs aren't getting met because you felt you should always prioritize everyone else.
That's like a recipe for exhausting relationships.
It can be, and there's also that tendency German mentions to become the fixer or the peacemaker.
The fixer.
Yeah, feeling like others shouldn't feel uncomfortable emotions, sadness, anger, anxiety, so you feel you should jump in and solve their problems, make it better, smooth things over. Sometimes this comes from, maybe growing up in environments where you learned you had to manage external emotions to feel safe yourself.
Wow. Okay. So should statements.
Hmm.
They're not just minor nagging thoughts. They can seriously impact our self-worth, how we feel day to day, what we do, and even the health of our most important relationships.
Yeah.
A really pervasive pattern.
It absolutely can be. And this is the really important part, the empowering part. Once you start to understand these cognitive distortions, once you can identify them, that gives you the power to start challenging and changing them.
Okay, yes. That's the crucial next step.
Yeah.
How do we actually start spotting these shoulds in our own heads? They can feel so automatic.
They really can. But the most direct way, suggested by sources like Oak Health, is basically to become a detective of your own mind. Start actively listening for the specific language.
Just pay attention to the words.
Yeah. Catch yourself when you use words like should, must, ought to, or have to in your internal self-talk. Pay conscious attention when you're thinking about your own actions, your feelings, how other people are acting, or how a situation should be going.
So really tuning in to those specific trigger words in our inner monologue.
Exactly. It sounds simple maybe, but those words are like little red flags. And Oak Health suggests a really practical strategy to help with this: journaling.
Journaling, how would that work?
Try just writing down the should statements as you notice them pop up during your day. But don't just write the thought itself. Also note, when it happened, where you were, and maybe try to figure out why you think it came up right then.
Ah, okay. Like, just had the thought, I should really be working out right now. Noticed it while scrolling Instagram and saw a fitness influencer's post, feeling a bit sluggish. Something like that.
Exactly like that. Because doing that helps you start seeing the patterns. Are your shoulds triggered by certain situations, specific people? Feelings like stress, tiredness, comparison, do they pop up more at certain times of day in particular places?
So the context matters.
Immensely. Understanding those triggers gives you really valuable clues about why and when you tend to fall into should thinking. And just the act of writing it down starts to create a little bit of distance between you and the thought. You're observing it, not just being swept away by it.
That makes a lot of sense. It's hard to challenge something if you don't even realize you're thinking it. Okay, so we get better at spotting them. But then what? How do we actually start to change them? They can feel so deeply ingrained.
They can, and it definitely takes practice. But the core goal is really clear, and it comes straight from Ellis and REBT. The aim is to shift away from those rigid, demanding musts and shoulds and move back towards more flexible, realistic preferences.
From I must to I would prefer.
Essentially, yes. Moving from I must achieve X to prove I'm worthy to something like I'd really prefer to achieve X. It would be nice, but my worth isn't actually dependent on it. Replacing that absolute demand with a more flexible desire or wish.
Okay, so how do we make that shift? What's the method?
Well, the main therapeutic technique in both REBT and CBT is often called rational disputation or cognitive restructuring. Basically, it means actively questioning and challenging the irrational belief, the should statement. Ellis actually called this the D step in his ABC model. You dispute the belief.
So we literally argue with our should. What kind of questions should we be asking?
You can use questions that directly target the negative impacts we just talked about. So when you catch a should, ask yourself things like, okay, is this should actually realistic? Is it achievable right now, given everything else going on? My energy, the other person's situation.
Right, put it in context.
Yeah. And is this standard I'm setting for myself or someone else impossibly high? Am I demanding perfection in a world that isn't perfect?
Mm-hmm.
Or what are the real likely consequences if this should isn't met? Is it actually a catastrophe? Or is it maybe just uncomfortable, disappointing, or requires a change of plan?
Questioning the severity.
Exactly. And also, is this rigid rule actually helping me? Or is it just causing stress, guilt, anxiety, maybe even stopping me from taking action? And importantly, does this should allow for being human? Does it allow for mistakes, off days, learning curves, just basic human imperfection?
Those are great questions. They really force you to look at the thought critically instead of just accepting it as truth. They kind of poke holes in that rigidity.
That's the idea. You're examining its validity, its usefulness, and you can also bring in other cognitive restructuring techniques, like examining the evidence for the should.
Examining the evidence.
Yeah. Well, it's a general technique. It applies well here. Ask, what objective evidence actually supports the idea that things must or should be this specific way? Is this rule based on facts, on reality, or is it just my own internal subjective rule?
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. If you think, I should never make mistakes in my work, okay, what's the evidence? Have you actually never made a mistake? Does anyone you know never make mistakes? Likely, the evidence points to the opposite, that mistakes are normal, even necessary for learning.
Right, the evidence probably shows that the should is unrealistic.
Mm.
Okay, so you question it, examine the evidence, then what?
Then you work on replacing it, listing rational alternatives. So if that rigid thought, I should always be productive, is stressing you out and making you procrastinate, what's a more balanced, realistic, and genuinely helpful way to think about productivity?
Like coming up with a different thought.
Exactly. How could you rephrase that should as a preference or a more flexible goal? Maybe a rational alternative is, I aim to be productive most days, but I know rest is also necessary and productive in its own way.
Okay.
Or maybe, I'd prefer to get a lot done today, but right now I'm going to focus on these two key tasks. Or even, my worth isn't solely measured by my productivity today.
Yeah, those alternatives feel so much gentler, more flexible, less demanding.
And that gentleness. That brings us to another really key strategy that both Oak Health and German highlight: cultivating compassion.
Compassion.
Yeah. Those rigid should statements are inherently judgmental,
Mm.
right? They lack compassion. Oak Health explicitly suggests actively choosing compassion, especially for yourself, acknowledging you're human, you're imperfect, and that's okay.
And for others too.
Yes, they advise being careful with your words when applying shoulds to others, reminding yourself that they're also complex humans navigating their own challenges. So, countering that harsh judgment inherent in the should with deliberate kindness and understanding.
That makes sense. Fight judgment with compassion.
Precisely. German really emphasizes this too. A major goal when working on perfectionism and the shoulds that drive it is building a more compassionate relationship with yourself, learning to be less critical, more accepting, more loving of your imperfect self.
So instead of, I should have handled that perfectly, the thought becomes more like,
Maybe that situation was tough, I did the best I could with what I had at the time, and I can learn from it. Or simply, mistakes happen. It's part of the process. I don't need to be perfect to be okay.
it's like reframing imperfection. Not as a failure to meet a should,
Mm-hmm.
but just as normal.
Exactly, normalizing the human experience. And another really simple, practical technique Oak Health suggests is practicing gratitude.
Gratitude, how does that help with shoulds?
By shifting your focus, regularly taking time to notice and appreciate what is going well, what you're thankful for, the blessings in your life, rather than constantly dwelling on the shortcomings or how things should be but aren't, can really help shift your overall perspective.
Moving from a mindset of lack things aren't how they should be
Yeah.
to a mindset of appreciation for what you do have.
Right. Gratitude acts as a kind of antidote to the negative focus that shoulds often thrive on. And finally, it's worth remembering, as we touched on, that for some people, really challenging these shoulds might mean going a bit deeper.
Deeper how?
Addressing those underlying beliefs that might be fueling them, that feeling of not being enough, the intense need for control, maybe a deep fear of rejection or criticism. German mentions that therapy goals often include things like learning to tolerate uncomfortable emotions better and fundamentally recognizing that your worth as a person isn't tied solely to your achievements or your ability to meet every single should.
So while these self-help strategies are powerful tools for tackling the thoughts themselves, sometimes getting at the roots might involve more support.
Absolutely. The sources suggest that while you can make huge progress identifying and challenging specific thoughts on your own, untangling the core beliefs that generate them can sometimes be a more involved process, and therapeutic approaches are often designed specifically for that deeper work.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful, a really thorough look at should statements. Let's try and wrap this up for everyone listening.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've really unpacked how should statements, when they function as cognitive distortions, are these rigid, absolute demands about how you, other people, or the world must operate.
Right, they're not just harmless preferences. They often stem from or connect to things like perfectionism and maybe that deeper feeling of not being quite enough.
Exactly. And we saw how much impact these rigid demands can have. They create unrealistic expectations, almost guaranteeing failure or disappointment.
And they fuel all those difficult emotions: guilt, frustration, anxiety, shame.
Right. And drive unhelpful behaviors like avoiding things, procrastinating, and they can really strain relationships through things like people pleasing or difficulty setting boundaries.
But the really hopeful message here is that this pattern can be changed. You can learn to manage it.
Definitely. By becoming more mindful, maybe using tools like journaling, you can get much better at just noticing these shoulds when they pop up. Awareness is the first step.
And once you notice them, you have tools drawn directly from these sources we discussed to challenge them, asking those critical questions about realism and usefulness.
Examining the evidence, finding more balanced alternative thoughts, consciously replacing the rigid demand with a more flexible preference, those are powerful steps.
And layering on that compassion for yourself and others, practicing gratitude to shift focus. These all help loosen the grip of those rigid rules.
Absolutely. And remembering, as Sherman points out, that working on perfectionism or these should patterns isn't about fixing something that's broken in you. It's about developing a trait, building skills for a more flexible, self-compassionate way of moving through the world.
It really is a journey towards feeling less internal pressure, fostering better mental well-being overall. So as you go forward from this deep dive, maybe here's something concrete to think about.
Okay.
As you go about your day tomorrow, just try to notice, no judgment. Just notice every time that word should, or maybe must, ought to, have to,
Yeah.
pops into your internal dialogue.
Yeah.
Just the act of noticing itself is huge.
Mhm.
And then maybe just pick one of those shoulds that you notice, just one, and ask yourself, what would this sound like if it were simply a preference, not a demand? What could shifting just one of those internal demands into a flexible desire actually change about how you feel in that single moment?